You
How
are
are
going to.
you?
We are good, thank you. How are
Yeah,
you?
we are
Doing
still here.
well.
We are still here from the morning.
Yeah.
So you are going to tell us something about deliverability.
I am going to talk about deliverability and I am going to talk about how we are currently changing deliverability and how things are going to be a challenge as we move forward.
All right.
So, the title of the talk today is How the Past Informs Us and Prepares Us for the Future of Deliverability. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Laura Atkins. I've been doing email and deliver. What was that?
Sorry. Let's go on.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Laura Atkins. I am a deliverability person. I've been doing email deliverability for well over 20 years now. I kind of started in the anti-spam end of things, worked at an abuse desk at a major network service provider for a while, and then ended up taking over some deliverability issues in the early 2000s and started Word to the Wise with my partner. What we're going to look at today is we're going to look at what's going on in deliverability right now and how it is changing and how it is going to change and how we can prepare for that. So let's get started. Right now, we are in a period, I think, and we'll talk a little bit about it, but in terms of deliverability, I think it's a mature product, right? People know what it is when you say deliverability. And this has been true for about the last decade or so. Deliverability is just a known quantity. Sure, individual marketers and particular mail campaigns and things like that would have problems. And mail would sometimes fail to deliver, but people like myself and the folks that work at the ESPs and the folks who work at the deliverability service providers, they would all have the ability to say, hey, this is what happened, and this is how we can fix your problem. We have tons of commercially available tools. There's articles, there's blog posts, there's everything. I mean, deliverability is such a mature marketplace now that you can actually search for stock photos with the term deliverability, and the stock photo sites know what you mean. It wasn't always that way. And so how we got here, I think, is going to help us understand where we're going and where we're going to get to. So last October, Yahoo and Google made a joint announcement about how they were going to change how they were filtering mail or how they were changing the standards, and that they were going to actually start filtering differently depending on whether or not you met those standards. And this particular announcement took a number of folks by surprise. I mean, people just had almost meltdowns, and there were multiple calls with Google and Yahoo and ESPs and deliverability people, and there was a huge amount of turmoil in the industry when Google and Yahoo came out and said, we're going to start enforcing these spammers. But the thing is that this surprised, nobody had to be surprised about this. Everything, or almost everything that they said, were standards that were and are current best practices. They are things that people should have already been doing. And they are things that many people, myself included, had told marketers and had told organizations and had told companies over and over and over again, you need to do this. This is a best practice. You need to be doing this. And inevitably, the response that I would get back would be, well, is it going to hurt our mail deliverability if we don't do this? And, in an effort to be honest, I would say, well, probably not. This is what they want. This is a best practice. But right now, if you don't do it, it's not going to hurt your deliverability. Now, as we move forward, and after this announcement from last October, it will hurt your deliverability. And that is the change. It's that these things that we have been telling you to do will hurt your deliverability if you don't do them. So for those of you who haven't heard about what these changes are, I thought I'd do a really quick kind of overview of what those changes are. And I've divided them mentally into two broad categories. One is the changes that your ESP and your infrastructure provider needs to do, and one is the changes that you, the sender, needs to do. And the ESP needs to provide a one-click unsubscribe header that's compliant with the RFCs. They need to make sure that they are capable of providing domain alignment for all of their customers. They need to set up the correct reverse DNS. They need to set up TLS for all outbound mail. All of this is stuff that, for the most part, none of you need to worry about. This is going to be done by your infrastructure providers. On the sending side, you're going to need to make sure that your authentication is aligned so that your mail is authenticating as you, not as your ESP. You're going to need to keep your complaints low. 0.3% is kind of the magic line that everybody has kind of put in the sand. But I would say that if you're even close to the 0.3% line, you're already having deliverability problems. And you really need to think about how can you better serve your audience to lower the number of spam complaints that you're getting. You need to ensure that you process unsubscribes from the list unsubscribe header within 2 days. And that's a little bit different, and that's a much faster schedule than a lot of regulations give and a lot of regulations require. But the Google and Yahoo are expecting that you will process unsubscribes quickly. And then finally, you need to send mail from a domain you control. And again, these are all things that you should have already been doing. There were a couple new things that were also introduced, but overall, everything that was recommended should have already been done. So how did the industry respond? Well, the industry kind of jumped up, and everybody started, from the time the announcement happened in October, even through till now, I'm still seeing some folks trickle in and say, hey, we're going to do a deliverability seminar, we're going to do a talk, we're going to provide you with information. But ever since October, companies have jumped. They have scrambled to rework development plans on the ESP level to make sure that they can meet these standards that they should have already met. Folks like me who are writing policies and who are trying to manage email deliverability are working with our customers and are working with the ESPs to make sure that the communications are there and that the way that we're presenting this to the customers and the way we're presenting this to the senders makes sense to them and that they understand what they need to do. Customer support teams are kind of scrambling to put together guidance documents and webinars and all of this stuff so that folks can understand the changes to their customers. All in all, in this last 6 months, since about October of last year, I am seeing more focused attention on deliverability than I've ever seen. And maybe we can talk about really long times ago when people were trying to figure out how to filter spam. But in reality, this is a very focused time for deliverability. And if we look back a little bit, and if we take that step back and we look at what happened 15, 20 years ago, we can actually see some of the same things happening, where what we were undergoing and the changes that we were experiencing and the things that we had to do, we were all making it up as we went along. Deliverability is a fairly new area of expertise. In some ways, it's even newer, I think, than email marketing, because there are folks, who were email marketing back in the late 90s. But deliverability didn't really start to become a thing or a term or something people did as a career until 2002, 2003, 2004, that kind of time period. So if we think about the early 2000s, we're looking at a time where spam was massively on the increase. It was a huge issue, but we really didn't have any tools. You can see there's a couple screenshots here, and it's hard to read in these screenshots, but I was kind of laughing. I found some of them are like off of the AP website, and some of them are off of articles that were written around the time, the Hotmail and the AOL screenshots. And if you actually read the titles of all of the messages that are in the mailbox, like the AOL one is all spam. It is all spam. The Hotmail one is probably about 80 or 90% spam. And that actually reflects what we were seeing in our mailboxes at the time. Some estimates were that 85 or 90% of all email was actually spam. And what happened was the mailbox providers and governments and individuals and everybody who was trying to figure out what to do were just throwing lots and lots and lots of different techniques at the wall to see what we could do to get spam to stop. There wasn't really any automation. We didn't have feedback loops. We didn't have a "this is spam" button. A lot of the filters at the ISPs were actually being handwritten by people. There was actually a company at the time that left email addresses on websites, and when those email addresses were scraped and got spam, they had an entire boiler room of people who were writing manual rules to block that spam and then pushing that out to their customers. And that was actually one of the anti-spam companies at the time. The "this is spam" buttons were new. AOL and Yahoo were all trying to figure it out. And I remember I was sitting at a conference. I was actually at a panel talking about deliverability in 2004 in Aspen. And one of the audience questions was, what are we going to do with this new Yahoo spam button thing? And as Yahoo originally rolled out their spam button, one of the things that they did to kind of introduce this concept to their users and introduce this concept to the folks who were receiving mail was they actually had a contest. And every time you hit the "this is spam" button, it would enter you in the contest. And I don't even remember what they were giving away. But the idea was they were trying to teach people that you could actually report spam with this giant button that was in your mail interface. So it was very chaotic. It was incredibly chaotic, and everything was changing on a regular basis. The ISPs didn't have a good way to sort out good mail from bad mail. We really didn't have domain authentication. SPF was just kind of starting to come out. I actually found an old AOL blog site from the old AOL Postmaster pages I was researching for this talk, and it was dated 2007. I think I found it on the archives, and the only authentication technique they were talking about was SPF. So we were all struggling, and marketers were really struggling to kind of find their way, and the ISPs were struggling to find their way, and everybody was trying to figure out, what are we going to do with this new thing, which is great and awesome, and email is just this wonderful way to talk to customers and to sell things and to market to people, but we also have all of this problem with spam. And so we kind of hit an inflection point. And I talk a lot in my consulting work with my clients about inflection points. As a company gets bigger, as their mail programs get more complicated, they kind of go through these inflection points, and they might discover that their deliverability gets worse, even though they haven't changed anything. And what has really changed is they've gotten bigger, and so they've gone into a different bucket at the ISPs, and it's the inflection point. And we talk about that, and we talk about how they can deal with it and what kinds of new things they need to do. But inflection points aren't just a company thing. They're also like a societal thing. We hit points in different, society itself goes through these inflection points where things change. And I think, in the mid-2000s, we really went through a major inflection point in terms of email marketing and deliverability. And that got us to where we are today. And immediately after or during the inflection point, and it's kind of this nebulous idea. It's not like there's a specific point in time where you can point to, this is before the inflection and this is after. It's kind of this nebulous, can happen over a couple of years or whatever. But we had this chaotic piece, and as we started to come out of it, and as we started to get later in the 2000s, we found a bunch of things happened. One, the filters got a lot better. There was automation coming in. It was the beginning of machine learning. It wasn't, we called it algorithmic filtering, but it was what is now machine learning. There were companies like ReturnPath and Goodmail and Habeas, and all of these companies that were providing certification or some way that you could get a little badge on your email, or that you could get a special mark on your IP addresses that would allow you to bypass some of the filters, because these companies would say these senders are good. We had a lot of the ISPs started making up postmaster pages so that you had clear guidance on what they were expecting. You had feedback loops were being broadly adopted across the across the internet and across the big ISPs. And so we had a way, we went through all of this chaos when we didn't know what was going on. But when we got to the other side, we had clarity, and we had ways that we could get our mail delivered, and we had rules, and we had guidelines, and we had best practices. And it was better for senders. It was better for marketers. They had things that they could do to get their mail to the inbox. It was better for the ISPs because they had ways to make their inboxes better for their users. It was better for the users because they didn't have mailboxes full of spam. They had they had a spam folder that they could check, but they also had their inbox, which was the mail that they actually wanted to receive. We also saw that a lot of the ISPs actually started working closely with the senders and with the ESPs, and there was some collaboration there. And how do we make this better for our users? And how do we stop bad customers from getting on our ESP networks and causing deliverability problems for all our other customers? And so there was a lot of collaboration, and we all kind of knew what we were doing. And within a decade, in the mid 2010s, we had an overflowing number of tools. We had processes, we had choices, we had ways that we could get our mail into the inbox. And we had a lot of clarity on how to do it. But in the last 3 or 4 years, what I'm starting to see, maybe the last 12 to 18 months, maybe it's not as long as the last 3 or 4 years, because we certainly know that the last 4 years have been chaotic outside the email space. But I've been noticing that deliverability is getting harder. I'm seeing more and more and more instances where standard deliverability advice and the things that were working and that we could reliably fix deliverability problems aren't as effective. The answers that we gave, the techniques that we had created and solidified and knew worked, they're just not quite working the same. And even those of us who are in the trenches and who are doing this all the time are kind of like, have you seen this? Hey, has this happened to you? Wait, what's going on here? And we look at that in the context of what Google and Yahoo have announced. So we're already kind of in this chaotic spot. And then we have this announcement from Google and Yahoo. And we're already kind of in the, what's going on now? What are we going to do now? And we're getting to a point where everything's changing. We're seeing open rates are not telling us what they used to tell us. We're seeing even clicks aren't telling us what they're telling us, what they used to tell us. We've always had the problem with some filters that are following every link in an email and giving you clicks where you shouldn't have clicks, but now that's becoming worse. And there was in the last 3 or 4 months, there was an explosion of this at Hotmail and Microsoft owned domains. And there's a whole, prefetching of images. And so opens aren't correct and all of this. And all of these changes and all of these challenges are making it much more difficult to get mail into the inbox and to have the answers that everybody's looking for from us. We also have, mailbox providers giving users choices about privacy. So they're being they're taking on the ability to protect a user's privacy. So they're prefetching images. Sometimes they're clicking on links. They're doing things to make it harder to track their users because that's what users want. But it is just creating this chaos. On top of that, we're seeing other changes. We're seeing other challenges, societal shift in privacy, societal shift in what applications are allowed to do, what kind of tracking is okay. And certainly, GDPR is a part of that, but we're also seeing certain states in the US that are implementing more and stronger privacy laws. There's a whole lot of stuff going on. And I don't think we're quite sure where it's going to end up. I know I've been getting notifications that there's a new change in the EU now, and I have to give my permission to let Instagram share my data with Facebook, to share my data with WhatsApp, or what all of these things are. So there's certainly a lot of going on to limit the amount of tracking that senders can do, or that marketers can do, or that online companies can do. And this too, we're not sure where it's going to go, and we're not sure where it's going to happen. And then, of course, there is the AI disruption in the market as well. You know, AI is now the big thing, and everybody's looking at AI and how do we use it, and how do we identify targets, and how can we apply this to marketing and all of that. But again, we're back to that situation where we're not really sure what we're doing. We're just kind of throwing a lot of stuff at the wall and seeing what works, which is fine and it's great. And that's where innovation comes from, right? If you know what you're doing, you never innovate. But if you have to figure it out, that process of figuring out is the core of innovation. So what does this all mean? It means right now, to me, we're just in the middle of this inflection point. Marketing's challenging, deliverability is challenging, and I think it's actually going to get worse before it gets better. You know, we're not going to have the same kinds of answers that we did. We're not going to have the certainty that we did 5 years ago. But that does give us the opportunity to innovate, and it gives us the chance to say, hey, where are we going to go? What kind of future do we want to see? We're not just being carried along. We're not just following the rules. We're not just pretending or, you know, looking at what other people have done. We have the opportunity, and we have the space, and we have the time, and we have the chance to say, what do I really want to do? What can I do? What kinds of interesting things can I do for my company? What can I do for the world? What can I do for marketing? How can I innovate? And that's what an inflection point really gives us, is that chance to innovate. So what does that mean for the future? And I don't think any of us can say, you know, this is what the future is. And we don't know what it's going to look like. I certainly don't know what it's going to look like. I know what I'd like it to look like, but I don't know what it is going to look like. But if we look at what happened before and after the last inflection point, at least, you know, in the marketing and deliverability space, I think we can set ourselves up for success on the other side. So what are a few of those things that I think are going to come out of this inflection point, and that we need to remember as we go through, and as we consider that innovation, as we consider those changes, as we consider what kind of future we want to see? First, treat those best practice recommendations as future requirements. You know, the things that Google has said you have to do, the things that Yahoo has said you have to do, they have been best practices for more than a decade. And if you still look inside their blog posts and in their facts and all of the information that they're out there, there's some hints scattered in there that there's more requirements coming. You know, there are places in there where they say, this is the best practice. We're not going to make you do it now, but this is a best practice. And I think that we need to be aware that this is a best practice now means it's going to be a requirement in the future. And when you think about what Google and Yahoo are doing, they're actually, everything they're doing is data driven. And we've certainly seen them in talks, and we've seen them in their Q&A sessions, and where they've been available to answer questions. The things that they have said is that, well, we implemented this because we saw how much bad mail it would block and how much good mail it would let in. They know the data. They know who is currently complying. They know who is not quite there yet and who is still in the process of getting to their new standards. And once they get to that point, and once they're comfortable with these new standards, they're going to start looking at the things that they're recommending as best practices now. So look at those best practice recommendations. Look at what the ISPs are saying, and treat those recommendations as future requirements and build them into your processes, build them into your vision for your company in 4 years, build them into your marketing so that the next time they make an announcement, you're not one of the companies scrambling to try and get things implemented in a short period of time. The second thing that I think we have to be prepared for is less user-focused tracking. Consumer privacy is a big issue. It's becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger issue, particularly here in the EU. But I think it's also, we're kind of seeing a resurrection of consumer protection in the US as well, where, the government is now, and the federal government and the state governments are now stepping in and saying, you know what? This free-for-all that you've had for years and years and years, we're not quite sure that's working for consumers. And so we're going to step in and we're going to do some things to protect consumers. And blocking the ability of marketing companies and blocking the ability of online companies to interfere with users, to track users. I don't know how many people have seen the news that just came out in the last day or so about what Meta had done, in that they basically man-in-the-middled a bunch of folks' phones so that they could spy on what their competitors were doing. I expect that those things are going to be frowned upon more and more, and that Meta may actually incur some problems based on that activity. And even if Meta doesn't get any specific pushback, there's going to be some changes, I think, in terms of security, and there's going to be new laws or new rules implemented about what you can and cannot do on people's individual devices. And you need to be aware, and you need to be really kind of cognizant of the fact that the engagement data that we have been using for years in email marketing is not as accurate and is not as useful and is not as appropriate it's not telling us what we think it is. Apple will open an email before anybody has actually looked at the message. Google will load an email and load pixels and show opens when nobody has looked at that message. Appliances will click on links. All of those things are causing issues with tracking. Now, what does that mean? That means you have a chance to figure out what are better metrics, to figure out what actually impacts your bottom line. How are you going to improve things so that you can survive as a company and you can do the things that you need to do in a space where privacy is more regulated and is important, and that you have to meet certain criteria. Finally, finally, transitions are hard. Transitions are so hard. And I think, as a society and as a globe, we've been through so many transitions over the last year or the last 4 years with a global pandemic and all of these changes, that we're all kind of not sure what is going on, and we're all a little uncertain. And I think that's part of why we're going through these societal transformations. That's part of why we're in the inflection point. It's not just isolated, it's everything because of what we've been through. But I think you have to acknowledge, and it's important to understand, that we are in that transition phase, that things are changing, that stuff is happening, that even those of us who are in the trenches and who are doing deliverability and who are creating the techniques to address a particular deliverability problem and who are trying to sort out what things are happening, even we're not sure what's happening. And we're seeing a lot of changes. We're seeing new types of bounces from AOL and Yahoo and Google, and we're seeing Microsoft is doing some weird stuff behind the scenes, and we're not sure what that means. And so we're all kind of just watching, collecting data, and then using that data in order to better help you get your mail delivered. But it does mean that there's some uncertainty there. And it doesn't mean that your ESP doesn't know what's going on. It doesn't mean that your deliverability person is incompetent. It doesn't mean that somebody's just trying to tell you, oh, I don't know, because they don't want to help you. The answer is right now, we kind of don't know a lot of things that we knew 3 years ago. And so you have to expect that uncertainty, and you have to be open to the idea that maybe things are going to change a little bit, and that maybe we'll have to try 3 or 4 things instead of just being able to say, okay, if you do this, this will fix things. And I think we're at the stage now where we can take some questions.
Wow, really interesting. Thank you so much. Actually, I have a philosophical question.
Okay. It's a philosophical talk.
Well, the email standard protocol is older than me. We have tried to patch those like holes in the protocol for so many times. We still get most of the traffic in the world, which is spam, basically. Do you think that those latest improvements that the Gmail and the Yahoo are pushing, could they eliminate spam now, or does it make an improvement that is worthwhile for this? Yeah, sorry.
No. There's 2 parts to that question. One, unfortunately, it's not going to eliminate spam. Because a lot of the spam these days and a lot of the spam that we're seeing is actually very organized. I won't go so far as to say criminal, although a lot of them are breaking different laws, but they're very organized groups that have set out to do things that will get through the filters. And so, if you talk about, okay, well, we're going to go demarc and everything has to align, and these are kind of the requirements for deliverability, and you have to have SPF and you have to have DKIM. Over the last 12, 18 months, probably 2 years, because the panel I did in London a few years ago was about this. There are companies out there that are aggressively stealing people's authentication. And so they're doing things, they'll steal your DMARC, your DKIM signature, and send mail pretending to be you through a DKIM signature. So their mail is authenticated as you, and then it's your reputation that suffers. And there's other stuff that they're doing with SPF, and it's your reputation that suffers. So they're organized, and they're trying very hard to poke holes in everything that we've done. But the flip side of that is that what Google and Yahoo are doing will help make the end user's mailbox much more usable. There are still the spammers out there who are, sending mail that's wholly unauthenticated, that they're, going out through botnets, and they're doing all of this stuff. And in that case, yes, the mail will have a better effect. It will have an effect. And we're actually seeing, it's kind of funny, you can tell, there's some folks in the marketing space where what they're doing is kind of borderline, and I wouldn't call it necessarily spam, but it's really quite borderline. And they're the ones that are really struggling. And they're the folks that are going, but I don't want to authenticate as myself. I just want to use Amazon's authentication. I just want to use MailChimp's authentication. I just want to authenticate as SendGrid. I don't want to have to authenticate as me, because if I authenticate as me, all my mail goes to the spam folder. And we're actually seeing that happen. And so it's that kind of borderline mail where, they're a little aggressive and they're a little less than careful about how they collect email addresses and all of this. And it's already having an effect because they're already struggling.
Okay. But considering that Gmail and Yahoo are already so big, okay, Microsoft too, I don't know what their market share might be, but more and more regulations or like technical requirements from their side, doesn't the email standard, which is basically open to everyone, doesn't it get too regulated, maybe like a monopoly style lock-in in the future, where it isn't possible for everyone to send email anymore?
It's not possible for everyone to send email cheaply anymore. And I know this has been kind of been a big bit of discussion in different places, particularly folks where you see some of the hobbyists and some of the folks who actually work on the email standards and who are the folks who, like us, will be, you know, running a mail server in a closet in their house because that's what they do. You know, you can't, the price of entry to get in to be able to send email effectively has gone up. And it used to be that anybody could stand up a mail server. I mean, I certainly remember back when we started the company in 2001, that our mail server was a little computer tower case that was behind the futon in our living room. You know, and all our mail actually came into our living room. And you know, we were on a cable modem. I don't remember. It was we were in Silicon Valley, so we had some sort of broadband connectivity, but all of the mail. And then, you know, as we got a little bit bigger and as things changed and as connectivity changed and as the rules changed, we had to rent a cabinet in one of the big data warehouses out there. So we still had our own hardware, we still had our own connection, but we had to move it out of the house. We had to move it into a more professional environment. And, you know, it's not, you can't just buy a cheap little Linux box anymore and stand up your own mail server. You've got to be able to, particularly if you want to send mail at any volume. But I don't think that's a monopoly. You know, email is still an open standard. It's not quite like the Facebook monopoly or the Meta monopoly. You know, yes, Google and Yahoo are somewhat collaborating on improving the standards, but I think those standards are actually a good thing, and they're best practices that we've recommended. But if you look in Europe, you've got, you know, GMX, you've got web.de, you've got Orange in France, you've got all of these other email service providers and ISPs that have somewhat different standards and have somewhat different filters. And it's not like it's one, it's like it's many. And there is a certain stickiness. It's hard to give up an email address that you've had for years. I mean, I still have the Hotmail address that I set up in 1996. You know, and it still gets mail. Most of it's spam, but you know, it still gets mail. But you know, and so email addresses are kind of sticky for a lot of folks, particularly those of us who might be a little bit older and you know, have not had 17 email addresses since we were 12. But I don't think it's quite at the monopoly level. Although I know there are folks that are trying to argue that, and you know, are just in the, well, they shouldn't be doing any spam filtering at all, which I think our mailbox, because of what we do, our mailboxes are not spam filtered. We have, and it's awful. I mean, there are days where it's really bad. You know, we certainly have our individual filters and some stuff, but you know, most of my clients come to me because they're being blocked. And so if I'm on a commercial provider, they wouldn't be able to get to me, so.
Okay. Quickly, we have 2 minutes. Do you think that the legislation is able to follow industry? I mean, you said meta monopoly. In EU, they like made some kind of new legislation, so Facebook would have to ask you for permission. They can use your data for personalized ads or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's a joke, because if you don't allow, then you cannot use this platform anymore. So anyone will allow all those permissions for Facebook, and basically they will do anything they want anyway. So
yeah, I mean, that's some of the political and societal changes, and that's not my area of expertise.
Okay.
But that is certainly it's a problem. I mean, you know, that there is so little accountability for some of these really big companies. That is a problem, and I think we're going to see folks try and address those. I know GDPR was actually one attempt to address that, and it did change things a little bit, but you know, the big companies, the Metas and the Googles or the Alphabet or whoever they are these days, you know, they pushed back really hard against GDPR and some of the regulations, and so I think it's been less effective. And I think we're 5 or 6 years out now from when the rules went into effect, and we now have court cases and Schrems and all of that. And I think we're going to see that the courts and the legislatures and the legislators are going to start getting more involved and say, okay, this didn't work. What do we do next? And sometimes that's good, and sometimes that's really scary.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Laura. It was really insightful again.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.